By 1943, the air war over Europe was at a breaking point. American bombers were being torn apart by the Luftwaffe, and the dream of daylight precision bombing seemed doomed. But then, a new fighter appeared in the skies. Sleek, fast, and with a range that stretched all the way to Berlin. It was the North American P-51 Mustang. For Germany, the day they met this aircraft would mark the beginning of the end of their control of the skies. A desperate battle for the skies. By mid-1943, the war in Europe had reached a critical juncture. On the ground, the Wehrmacht still occupied much of the continent. In the east, the Red Army was clawing back territory at staggering cost. In the Mediterranean, Allied landings in North Africa and Italy had pushed Axis forces into retreat. But it was in the air above Germany that the battle for the future of the war was being decided. The United States Army Air Forces, recently committed to the European theater, believed that daylight precision bombing could break the German war machine. The idea was simple in theory but brutal in execution. Massive formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators would fly deep into enemy territory, strike industrial targets, and cripple the Reich's ability to wage war. By day, their bombs would hit factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs with surgical accuracy. By night, the Royal Air Force would continue the assault with area bombing, devastating cities and morale. But theory soon clashed with reality. The B-17 and B-24 were tough aircraft, bristling with machine guns, but they were not invincible. German defenses were fierce. The Luftwaffe's network of radar stations, flak batteries, and fighter bases stretched across occupied Europe, ready to intercept the bombers as soon as they crossed the coast. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s swarmed from the clouds in coordinated attacks, striking head-on or diving from above, their cannons tearing into the bomber formations. The early missions were costly. In August 1943, a raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and Regensburg ended in disaster. Out of 376 bombers dispatched, 60 were shot down and many more limped home riddled with holes, engines smoking, crews dead or wounded. 2 months later, a second Schweinfurt raid cost the 8th Air Force another 60 bombers out of 291. Nearly 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. The losses were catastrophic. Within Germany, the propaganda ministry seized on these victories. Newsreels showed burning bombers falling from the sky, declaring that the Luftwaffe still commanded the air. German pilots, many of them hardened aces with dozens or even hundreds of kills, exuded confidence. To them, the sky over the Reich was still theirs. The problem for the Americans was range. Fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were effective but limited. Their fuel tanks allowed them to escort bombers only part of the way into Germany. Once they turned back, the bombers were alone, and that was when the Luftwaffe struck hardest. German pilots learned to wait until the escorts peeled away, then pounced on the unprotected formations, exacting a terrible toll. For the crews inside the bombers, the experience was harrowing. Hours of flight at high altitude in freezing conditions, oxygen masks frosting over, engines roaring, the constant threat of flak bursting around them. Then came the fighters, dozens at a time, their tracers streaking through the formation. Gunners fired back desperately, but every mission ended with empty seats at the mess hall and names scratched off the roster. Allied commanders feared the campaign might collapse. Losses of 20% or more on a single mission could not be sustained. Some argued that daylight bombing was suicidal. Others insisted it was the only way to bring Germany to its knees. The debate raged as 1943 drew to a close, but one thing was clear. Without a long-range escort fighter, the strategy was doomed. The Luftwaffe, for its part, believed it had the measure of the Americans. Confident in their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, bolstered by the defensive wall of flak and radar, they thought they could bleed the bomber offensive until it faltered. Many German pilots had been fighting since 1939. They were skilled, aggressive, and unafraid. The Reich's leadership boasted that its skies would remain impenetrable. But storm clouds were gathering. In Allied hangars in Britain, a new fighter was being readied for combat. It was not the bulky Thunderbolt or the twin-tailed Lightning. It was something sleeker, faster, and far more capable. a machine that combined American design with British engineering brilliance. Its name was the P-51 Mustang. At first, the Germans did not fear it. They had seen new enemy aircraft before and beaten them. But what they did not yet realize was that this fighter was different. With its streamlined fuselage, laminar flow wing, and, most crucially, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine under its nose, the Mustang could do what no Allied fighter had done before: fly to Berlin, fight German interceptors on equal terms, and bring the bombers home again. For the Luftwaffe, the reckoning was coming. The Schweinfurt raids had been their triumph, proof of their dominance. But soon, very soon, they would encounter the Mustang. And on that day, they would begin to understand that the skies over Germany no longer belonged to them. Enter the Mustang. The winter of 1943 brought a sense of crisis for the United States 8th Air Force. Losses from the daylight bombing campaign were mounting to unsustainable levels. The bombing strategy itself was at risk of collapse. Yet even as doubts swirled, a new aircraft was arriving on the airfields of East Anglia, one that would tip the balance of the air war. The P-51 Mustang had not begun life as a miracle weapon. Originally designed in 1940 for Britain, its early versions, powered by the Allison engine, were adequate at low altitudes but unimpressive at high ones. It was only when the British fitted it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin that the aircraft's true potential was revealed. The Merlin Mustang could climb, dive, and fight at high altitudes with astonishing performance. It combined speed, over 430 miles per hour, with maneuverability and endurance. Most importantly, the P-51 could carry drop tanks, which extended its range far beyond that of other American fighters. At last, the Allies had a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. By late 1943, groups like the 354th Fighter Group were among the first to take the Mustang into combat. Nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group, they introduced the aircraft to the skies over Europe with immediate effect. German pilots, accustomed to seeing American escorts peel away short of the target, suddenly faced an enemy that stayed with the bombers all the way in. The shock was immediate. Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled to intercept bomber streams over Germany only to find Mustangs waiting for them. Sleek, agile, and heavily armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, the P-51 could match the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190, the pride of the Luftwaffe, in speed and maneuver. At higher altitudes where the bombers flew, the Mustang often held the advantage. American pilots quickly developed new tactics. Instead of simply flying in tight formation alongside the bombers, they began to roam ahead and above, using the Mustang's speed and range to strike at German interceptors before they could even reach the bomber streams. This aggressive doctrine, seek, strike, destroy, turned the tables. No longer were escort fighters reactive. Now they were hunters. For bomber crews, the change was dramatic. Where once their formations had been savaged by waves of German fighters, now they saw dogfights erupting ahead of them. Mustangs diving into enemy formations and scattering them. Losses, while still heavy, began to fall. For the first time, there was a sense that daylight bombing might actually succeed. On the German side, disbelief gave way to alarm. Pilots who had fought since the early years of the war recognized instantly that the Mustang was different. Reports filtered up the chain of command. This new enemy fighter has great speed and endurance. It escorts the bombers all the way. We cannot shake it. At first, the Luftwaffe tried to adapt. New tactics were devised. Massed frontal assaults on bomber formations, coordinated waves designed to overwhelm escorts. But the Mustangs countered them. With drop tanks jettisoned, they could turn and climb with deadly precision, cutting into German formations before they reached the bombers. The psychological effect was profound. For years, the Luftwaffe had enjoyed the advantage of knowing the bombers' escorts would eventually turn back, leaving the heavies exposed. Now there was no sanctuary. Mustangs pursued German fighters deep into their own airspace, sometimes even strafing airfields on the return leg. The Reich's once proud defenders began to realize that the sky itself was slipping from their grasp. Civilians on the ground noticed it too. For the first time, German towns and cities witnessed American fighters roaming overhead in large numbers, engaging Luftwaffe aircraft above their very homes. The myth of Germany's invulnerable skies, cultivated by years of propaganda, began to crack. If the Americans could fight here, in the heart of the Reich, what did that say about the future of the war? American pilots, many of them young and relatively inexperienced compared to veteran German aces, found themselves growing in confidence. The Mustang gave them a machine that could compete head-to-head with the best the Luftwaffe had to offer. With superior numbers, steady training pipelines, and an industrial base that produced aircraft and spare parts in staggering quantities, the U.S. Army Air Forces now had the tools to grind down the Luftwaffe in a war of attrition. By early 1944, the writing was on the wall. German pilots still fought ferociously, and Allied bomber losses remained significant, but the edge had shifted. The Luftwaffe could no longer assume dominance when American bombers approached. Instead, they faced the grim reality of fighting an opponent who was not only equal in skill and machine but superior in numbers and endurance. It was during these early months of combat that the Luftwaffe truly met the P-51 Mustang. They saw it in their gun sights, in the contrails of dogfights stretching across the cold winter skies, and in the wreckage of their own aircraft shot down over fields and forests. And with each encounter, the realization deepened. The days of German control of the skies were numbered. What had begun as a desperate gamble by the Allies, daylight bombing into the heart of the Reich, was now becoming a hammer blow against Germany's capacity to resist. And the P-51 Mustang, sleek and deadly, was the weapon that made it possible. The Luftwaffe had not yet been broken, but the seeds of its destruction had been planted. The Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a symbol of industrial power, technological ingenuity, and the relentless momentum of a war Germany could no longer win. Big Week and the turning point. By early 1944, the strategic situation demanded a decisive blow. The Allies were preparing for an invasion of Western Europe, but before landing on the beaches of France, they had to ensure control of the skies. As long as the Luftwaffe could mass fighters over Normandy or over the Channel, any amphibious assault risked disaster. The German Air Force had to be crippled, its factories disrupted, its pilots thinned out. The answer was Operation Argument, soon known simply as Big Week. From February 20th to 25th, 1944, the 8th Air Force and the Royal Air Force Bomber Command launched a coordinated offensive against the German aircraft industry. The targets were aircraft assembly plants, component factories, and repair facilities scattered across the Reich, centers of production that kept the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in the air. The stakes could not have been higher. American bombers had already suffered unsustainable losses in 1943. Now, with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in meaningful numbers, the Allies were ready to risk everything in a campaign designed to bring the Luftwaffe into the open and destroy it. The offensive begins. On the morning of February 20th, massive formations of B-17s and B-24s lifted off from English airfields, climbing into the cold winter skies. Their engines thundered across the countryside, contrails stretching like scars across the horizon. For the German radar operators watching their screens, the picture was unmistakable. The Americans were coming, and in unprecedented numbers. The Luftwaffe responded as it had so many times before. Squadrons of Bf-109s and Fw-190s scrambled from bases across France, the Low Countries, and Germany itself. Aces like Walter Dahl, Adolf Galland, and Erich Hartmann led formations into the fray. They expected to savage the bombers as they had in 1943. But this time, something was different. Alongside and above the bomber streams flew hundreds of Mustangs. Their drop tanks gave them the endurance to reach Berlin and beyond. Their speed and maneuverability meant they could fight the Luftwaffe head-on. When the German fighters rose to attack, they found the P-51s already waiting. A new kind of escort. The tactics of the Mustang pilots had changed the nature of the air war. No longer did escorts merely fly in rigid formation with the bombers, reacting to enemy attacks. Instead, groups of P-51s swept ahead, actively hunting German fighters. They prowled above the bomber streams, diving into intercepting formations before they could organize. The results were devastating. German pilots accustomed to choosing the time and place of their attacks now found themselves ambushed. Massed assaults on bomber formations broke apart as Mustangs tore into them from above and behind. The once feared Sturmgruppen, heavily armed German units trained to penetrate bomber formations, suffered terrible losses as their slower Fw-190s were picked off by Mustangs before reaching their targets. For the bomber crews, the difference was unmistakable. They still faced flak, and fighters still attacked, but the scale of slaughter was reduced. More bombers returned. Fewer empty bunks awaited at evening roll call. Morale rose. The phrase "little friends," the affectionate nickname for fighter escorts, gained new meaning when the Mustangs appeared. German losses mount. As Big Week continued, the Luftwaffe was forced to rise again and again. Hitler demanded that the Reich skies be defended at all costs. Factories at Leipzig, Regensburg, Augsburg, Gotha, and Brunswick were all targeted. Every day, hundreds of American bombers flew, and every day the Luftwaffe threw itself into battle. The cost was catastrophic. Between February 20th and 25th, the Luftwaffe lost more than 600 fighters destroyed and hundreds more damaged. Even worse, many of these losses were not just machines but the veteran pilots who flew them. Unlike the Americans, who had a vast training pipeline and an industrial base that could replace aircraft and men, Germany could not recover. Its fuel supplies were dwindling, its training programs cut short, its replacements barely out of flight school. The American losses were also heavy. More than 250 bombers were shot down, and thousands of airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. Mustang squadrons suffered casualties too. Yet the critical difference was that the United States could sustain such losses, and Germany could not. Every Mustang shot down was replaced by another. Every bomber lost was followed by a new one rolling off the assembly lines. The Luftwaffe realizes the truth. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe was reeling. German commanders began to speak openly of the crisis. General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected leaders, admitted that the arrival of the P-51 had tipped the scales. "The day must come," he warned, "when the last bomber will be escorted by fighters from the English coast to its target and back again. Then the Luftwaffe will have lost the war." That day had already arrived. For the German people, the evidence was visible. They looked up and saw contrails crisscrossing the skies above their cities. Massive formations of bombers now accompanied by deadly escorts. The myth of German air superiority was shattered. Bombs fell on aircraft factories. Homes shook with the impact, and the defenders that once inspired confidence were now being hunted themselves. For the pilots who survived, the shock was profound. Many had fought since the early days of the war, racking up impressive victory counts. But no matter their skill, they could not overcome the sheer weight of American numbers, nor could they escape the reach of the Mustang. Dogfights that once promised glory now often ended with fiery death, the white vapor trails of P-51s slicing into formations. A shift in the war. The conclusion of Big Week marked a turning point in the air war. The Luftwaffe was not yet destroyed, but it was fatally weakened. From that moment on, it would never regain the strength needed to challenge the Allies in decisive numbers. The skies belonged increasingly to the Americans and their Mustangs. For the Allies, Big Week was vindication. The daylight bombing campaign, once in jeopardy, now had a chance of success. The Mustangs had proven their worth not just as escorts but as predators. Bomber crews returned with stories of enemy fighters being cut down before they reached the formations. The tide had turned. In the coming months, the Luftwaffe would continue to fight. It would rise over Berlin, over the Ruhr, over the oil fields of Romania. But every battle cost it more than it could afford. Every encounter with the Mustang bled it further. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy in June 1944, German air power was a shadow of its former self. Big Week had shown the truth. The Luftwaffe had met the P-51 Mustang in force, and realized, perhaps for the first time, that the skies over Germany were no longer theirs to command. The end of the Luftwaffe. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was in crisis. The losses of Big Week had torn holes in its squadrons, draining away veteran pilots who could not be replaced. Germany's aircraft industry, already battered by bombing, struggled to turn out new machines fast enough. Fuel supplies were dwindling, training hours were slashed, and inexperienced boys were being rushed into cockpits with only a fraction of the preparation their predecessors had received. Against this backdrop, the North American P-51 Mustang emerged not only as a weapon but as a symbol of Allied dominance. Normandy. The Luftwaffe kept at bay. When Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the outcome of the land battle depended heavily on the air. The planners of Operation Overlord knew that if German fighters could mass against the invasion fleet, the result might be catastrophic. But the Luftwaffe never appeared in strength. Mustang squadrons, together with other Allied fighters, swept the skies clear. They hunted German aircraft near the beaches, strafed airfields, and disrupted any attempt at concentration. Pilots patrolled aggressively, sometimes flying multiple missions a day, ensuring that the Wehrmacht soldiers on the ground faced relentless air attack while receiving little cover from above. The Luftwaffe's absence on D-Day was not by choice but by necessity. It had been bled white in the battles of early 1944, and what remained was pinned down by fuel shortages, poor training, and constant pressure from the Mustangs. German soldiers on the beaches, many of whom had expected the Luftwaffe to come to their rescue, looked up in vain. Instead of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, they saw P-51s diving to strafe their columns, hunting the Luftwaffe into extinction. After Normandy, the Mustangs' role only grew. With Allied armies breaking out into France and pushing toward Germany, the 8th and 9th Air Forces expanded their operations. The P-51 was now used not only for escort but also for offensive sweeps deep into enemy territory. Mustang pilots roamed across the Reich, attacking trains, convoys, and airfields. They destroyed aircraft on the ground by the hundreds, catching them lined up on runways or concealed in forest clearings. They strafed transport columns, disrupting reinforcements and supplies headed for the front. The Mustang's range allowed it to go anywhere: Berlin, Munich, the oil fields of Ploiești in Romania, and its speed meant it could dictate the terms of battle. For the Luftwaffe, the consequences were dire. Even when new aircraft such as the advanced FW-190D or the jet-powered Me-262 appeared, they were too few and too late. The young men rushed into service to fly them stood little chance against seasoned Allied pilots in superior numbers. Every mission seemed to end with more losses, more funerals, more irreplaceable aircraft burned on the ground. The Oil Campaign. One of the Mustang's most devastating contributions came in the oil campaign of 1944. The Allies recognized that fuel was Germany's Achilles heel. Synthetic fuel plants and oil refineries became priority targets, and P-51s escorted the bombers that struck them. When German fighters tried to intercept, they were cut down. When they stayed on the ground, Mustangs swept in to destroy them before they could take off. By late 1944, German fuel shortages had become crippling. Training flights were reduced to a handful of hours. Frontline pilots sometimes had enough fuel for only a single mission. The Luftwaffe was strangled, not only by loss of machines and men but by the simple lack of gasoline to fly. The Mustang had helped tighten that noose. The final blow. By early 1945, the skies over Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. Mustang pilots escorted bombers into Berlin itself, strafed targets as far east as the Oder River, and tangled with the last desperate defenders. The once proud Luftwaffe was a hollow shell. Its best pilots were dead or captured. Its newest recruits little more than cannon fodder. Even the introduction of the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, a technological marvel far ahead of its time, could not reverse the tide. The jets were fast, but there were too few of them, too late, and they were vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Mustang squadrons learned to wait near German airfields, pouncing on the jets as they climbed out or came in low on approach. The jets struck fear in bomber crews, but strategically, they could not save the Luftwaffe. As the Allies advanced on the ground, the air war turned into a rout. P-51s prowled with impunity, attacking anything that moved. Trains, trucks, even horse-drawn wagons. German civilians grew used to the sight of the silver fighters overhead, their long wings glinting in the sun. For many, they were the harbingers of inevitable defeat. Legacy of the Mustang. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the statistics told the story. The Luftwaffe had lost tens of thousands of aircraft in the defense of the Reich. Its best aces had fallen, one by one, in hopeless battles against superior numbers. Its factories lay in ruins, its fuel gone, its skies dominated by the Mustang and its Allied companions. Historians have since called the P-51 the fighter that won the air war in Europe. That title is not just a reflection of its performance as an aircraft. Fast, agile, long-ranged, but of the moment it represented. The day Germany met the P-51 was the day it realized that its strategy for the skies was doomed. No matter how brave its pilots, no matter how advanced some of its designs, it could not match the industrial power, training pipeline, and relentless momentum that the Mustang symbolized. The psychological impact was immense. For bomber crews, the sight of Mustangs overhead gave confidence that they might return home alive. For German civilians, the sight of Mustangs and bombers in their skies was proof that the Reich was vulnerable, that the war was being lost. For the Luftwaffe itself, the Mustang was a nightmare that never ended, a hunter that stalked them to the very end. In the years after the war, many Luftwaffe veterans admitted openly what they had felt in 1944. The P-51 had sealed their fate. Once it appeared in numbers, Germany could no longer hope to control the air. Without control of the air, it could not stop the bombers. Without stopping the bombers, it could not preserve its factories, its fuel, its infrastructure. Without those, the Reich was doomed. The P-51 Mustang was more than just an airplane. It was the embodiment of Allied industrial might, of American engineering married to British innovation, of the global coalition determined to defeat Hitler's regime. It proved that the skies over Europe would belong not to tyranny but to those who fought for freedom. And so, when the Luftwaffe finally collapsed, it was not in a single battle but in countless encounters, day after day, as Mustangs tore through formations, strafed airfields, and escorted bombers to targets that erased Germany's ability to fight. The day Germany met the Mustang was the day it began to lose the war in the air, and with it the war itself.